here with Dr. Perry Mehrling, Professor of Economics at Barnard College of Columbia University, to talk about his new book, The New Lombard Street. Tell me, what is the new Lombard Street?
The new Lombard Street is the way money markets work in the modern world, with modern finance and Wall Street and so forth. And in particular, I'm interested in this book in the role of the Fed in supporting that at times of crisis.
So you're referring to Walter Bagehot's book,
I am,
Lombard Street,
absolutely.
Which studied the Bank of England in the 1860s.
1873 was the new what I hope will come to be known as the old Lombard Street. He wrote this book, Lombard Street, a description of the London money market. And so that's my inspiration for this book, that writing an update now 130 some years later. And it's really about the New York money market and the dollar money market. So that's very much the analog I have in mind, yes.
And there are manuals like Marcia Stigham's book on the money market that really talk about the texture, institutional detail, and instruments. My understanding is you're trying to put this book in the context of the academic literature. You're trying to show, how we say, the evaporation of the institutions of the money market that emerged during the era of rational expectations in modern macroeconomics and financial theory.
That's right. What I'm trying to do is to, as I say sometimes, listen to the bankers, okay? And that means Marcia Stigham, who was listening to the bankers. This book, sounds like you know what this is a desk reference for people who trade these money markets. But it's quite impossible to it's not a theoretical book, it's an institutional book about these individual markets. That's on the one side, and on the other side, there's this whole academic literature about monetary policy, rational expectations, what have you. So I'm trying to be an economist who listens to the bankers and tries to abstract from that inductively a theory of how the world works. That's what I'm doing. I teach I've taught for many years out of Marcia Stigham. That's where I learned much of what I know about the money markets. But I'm connecting that to a historical and theoretical view of money markets.
So when you reintroduce the institutional texture of the money markets, how does the behavior of what's happening in money and finance change relative to the macro views that you just suggested, dominate the academic discourse?
Well, one of the things that you notice when you are a professor, as I am, is that most of the macroeconomic theories, most of the material, even in textbooks called Money and Banking, abstract from the money market. They abstract from the actual operations of the payment system, the actual operations. There's not discussion of the repo markets or the euro-dollar markets in any detail at all. And they're abstracting from this because intellectually, the economics profession decided that all of that was just plumbing, okay, and we don't need to pay attention to that, and we can sort of just summarize it as supply and demand, supply for money, demand for money, something like that. That it was thought of at the time as an intellectual refinement, as an analytical deepening, that everyone knew all about this institutional detail, and so we don't need to continue that. But of course, in the modern generation, no one knows about this institutional detail anymore. All we have are these abstract tools, and they're not connected with reality anymore. And that's what I'm trying to do, is to bring back that connection to reality, because reality has changed a lot since we developed these tools. Money and banking textbooks have not. Money and banking textbooks have moved 10% from where they were in 1955, whereas the actual organization of financial and money markets has changed 360 degrees.
When you look at the events we experienced, 2007, 8, and 9, the so-called crisis, it's been widely reported that the macroeconomics profession didn't see it coming and didn't explain it or even ex post understand entirely what happened. When you wrote this book, were you motivated by the crisis in relation to your understanding?
Very, very much so. I'll tell you a story about that. the crisis began for me in the summer of 2007 when I was noticing in the Financial Times the collapse of these Bear Stearns hedge funds. And in September of 2007, when I started to teach my money and banking class, the overnight interest rates were going haywire. The spreads between euro-dollar rates and Fed funds rates and repo rates. So it was very clear to me that something was very deeply amiss in the plumbing of the system. And I told my students, I remember that very first day, September 2007, I said, we've been building this parallel shadow banking system over the last decade or so, and it hasn't been through a stress test yet. And so we don't know where it's going to break. And I predict to you this semester, we're going to find out where it breaks. You know, we're doing that test in real time right now. The students thought I was crazy, I think, maybe the first day. But after a month or two, they thought maybe I could read the mind of God. But all I was really looking at was the short-term money spreads and seeing the kind of thing that an economist 100 years ago would have been paying attention to, these short-term money spreads, revealing stresses in the money market and asking, where are those stresses coming from? And what kind of actions are in interpreting the kinds of events in the world through that lens, the lens that I call the money view lens.
When you see the crisis in full bloom, the Lehman Brothers and others, it's certainly an impetus to the economics profession now, or in the finance theory profession, to understand what you might call breakdowns in liquidity or breakdowns in what you call the plumbing. Are you seeing the profession responding in changing research strategies, looking at some of these? Is there a renewed interest in the plumbing?
I think there is in some circles. I think there's cross-cutting influences here, okay? Partly there is, probably the dominant view at the moment is the crisis is over. We can go back to business as usual. But that's not everywhere, okay? There are plenty of people now talking about liquidity, using that word, okay, which didn't used to be a dirty word. You didn't get to speak in academic circles using words like that. Talking about the difference between funding liquidity and market liquidity. And of course, we're now having these new institutions like the Office of Financial Research that's being set up by Dodd-Frank, which is to collect all kinds of information that never was collected before because it was not thought to be useful or relevant, okay? And now, in the aftermath of the crisis, it is thought we need to learn about this. So we're going to be developing databases, and as we develop databases, we're going to have to be developing theories to make sense of those databases. So I think it's begun. The process of intellectual change has begun. It's slow and it lags behind events in the real world. That's the story I tell in the book. Okay, is that it's always the case that ideas are lagging behind material developments, so our job as thinkers, as academics, is to try to get as close to the development of as we can to appreciate that old thinking needs to be made new because the world is being made new every day.
There were many traditional scholars that looked at the money markets. You talked about Bagehot, or before that, Henry Thornton, or Ralph Hawtrey, Dennis Robertson, the early John Maynard Keynes. What happened to that so-called British banking school? Why did it evaporate from consciousness and awareness?
Well, this is a story of intellectual history that you're asking. Certainly, I identify myself as being in exactly that tradition. Those names are the names that are in my pantheon and on my bookshelf, and the place where I very much see myself as trying to look at the world. I tell my students this all the time. What would Bagehot say if he were around today and looking out at the world? And he knew a little bit of modern finance. You know, the instruments are different. Many of the issues are the same. The technology is different. We have computers and all of that and electronic exchanges. But what would Bagehot say today? So that's the intellectual tradition that I myself am rooted in. And I don't think it ever went completely away in the sense that there are people in central banks, very much. I would say Charles Goodhart is very much in that tradition. And many people who actually are in the markets themselves that tradition never sort of went away because it does engage with a certain reality that some people in their jobs have to engage with. Where it went away was in academia, okay, where academia went a different direction, and particularly in America, I think maybe more so than in the UK, where the economics profession after World War II reoriented itself as a kind of technocratic policy discipline that's giving advice to the mandarins in Washington, and from a scientific point of view. And so taking our hands out of the messy day-to-day of actual institutions and historical understanding, and having this abstract scientific approach that gets us above the fray. That positioning of economics, I think, has a lot to do with how certain kinds of styles of analysis fell out of favor.
It's an interesting question because you say you get above the fray, but you might miss the whole game if
Yes.
you don't understand the institutional context.
Absolutely.
Particularly, as you say, when you're giving scientific advice, I think of it as like medical diagnosis of the patient. You're giving this to the people in Washington who are in charge of regulation.
Mm-hmm.
If you misspecify the context and the institutional environment, then you're not giving advice on the regulatory environment that exists.
Diagnosing the patient without looking at the patient. Looking at the charts, not at the patient.
Maybe not even the charts.
Maybe not even.
Maybe at a hypothetical vision of what a human being should be.
You raise a very interesting point that, and during this crisis, as I'm sure you recall, there was a big shift in that. You know, the money markets are collapsing. And so the question is, who knows something about the money markets and who can give us advice about this? And it turned out that most of the people who were most prominent in the policy circles didn't actually know anything about this. So this was sort of my moment. I happened to know something about this. And so I got involved and was writing for the FT and making some policy proposals. And it was that made Princeton Press come to me and ask me, do you think you have a book in you about this? And that happened right after Lehman, actually. So I started talking to my students about this in the fall of 2007, but it was the fall of 2008, okay, when I got the contract to write this book. And I thought, yes, okay, I think this book now needs to be written, okay, and of course, the crisis wasn't over yet, and I got a bit distracted by and it's not over now, I think. It's continuing to run.
What do you see from your vantage point that leads you to suggest that the crisis is not over yet?
I think Dodd-Frank, in particular, the legislation that was supposed to say it's all over, go home, nothing to see here, has very much engaged with the banking system that we know about, the traditional banking system, and it's made some suggestions for reforming that and tightening up, but has not really engaged with the modern, with the shadow banking system, which is where the shift of our credit system from a bank lending system to a capital market system. This is the big thing that's sort of happened in the last several decades, and that requires an intellectual response. That requires us now rethinking about the whole issue of regulation, the whole issue of monetary policy, for that matter, in this new world. Dodd-Frank hardly touches that new world, and I think mostly because no one gave them advice. You know, these are congressmen making policy, and that's the task ahead of us, to develop some intellectual framework where we could give some good advice about what sort of framework would be necessary in order to make this brave new world of capital market credit system to make it work, to make it safe, to make it work for people, to make it work for economic development.
Well, we're very glad you wrote the book and started us on that path to understanding and rebuilding this system. As you've told me in private conversations over the months, the securitization markets broke down and we went back and tried to fix the banking system. While they interact, people don't seem to have what you might call a good grasp of the interconnection between securitization and banking, or how shadow markets replicated a banking system and created what they used to call maturity transformation, borrow short, lend long, and created the same instabilities that deposit insurance were designed to eliminate. So when I look at the new Lombard Street, I'm very grateful that you've set us on the road of illuminating the structures, the fault lines, and the challenges that we see in this modern money market. And if there's any chance to diminish or avoid that next crisis, I'm sure you'll have contributed to it. Thanks very much.
Thank you.